There's a good chance you drank this today. Almost nobody knows what it cost. Kings banned it. Sultans closed the shops. A king of England outlawed it, and lasted 11 days. And the empire it built was paid for by people who never tasted it. Before we go on, if stories like this are why you love history, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what's coming. 2 billion cups of coffee are drunk every day. It is the most traded agricultural commodity on Earth, and one of the most ordinary objects in your life. You probably have a mug within arm's reach right now, and behind it sits 600 years of smuggling, religious argument, state surveillance, revolution, and forced labor on a scale that is difficult to hold in your head. This is not the story of a drink. It's the story of what happens when a substance changes how human beings think, and how hard the powerful will fight to stop it. It starts on a high plateau in Ethiopia. The coffee plant is native to the forests of southwestern Ethiopia in the region of Kaffa. It grew wild there, a glossy-leaved shrub carrying small red fruit, what we call cherries, each one holding 2 seeds. Nobody planted it. Nobody had to. And there is a famous story about how it was discovered, which you have almost certainly heard. A goatherd named Kaldi, the story goes, noticed his goats leaping and refusing to sleep after eating the berries of a certain tree. He tried them himself. He brought them to a nearby monastery, and the monks discovered that a drink made from them kept them awake through their prayers. It's a wonderful story. It's also almost certainly not true. Here's the problem with it. That story does not appear anywhere in writing until 1671, roughly 800 years after it's supposed to have happened. It surfaces in Europe, in a book, at exactly the moment Europeans had become obsessed with coffee and wanted an origin story for it. Historians treat Kaldi as folklore. What's real is simpler and less tidy. The people of the Ethiopian highlands used the coffee plant for a very long time before anybody wrote anything down, chewing the cherries, mixing the ground beans with fat into a kind of energy ball for long journeys, brewing the leaves. There was no single moment of discovery and no single discoverer. Coffee emerged out of ordinary use, over generations, the way most things actually do. The thing you drink, roasted, ground, brewed hot, begins somewhere else. It begins in Yemen, in the 15th century, in a monastery. Across the Red Sea from the Ethiopian highlands lies the southern Arabian Peninsula, and in the mid-1400s, in the Sufi communities of Yemen, coffee stops being a plant and becomes a practice. Sufism is the mystical current within Islam, and its practitioners performed a devotion called dhikr, the remembrance of God, through long sessions of chanting and prayer, often deep into the night, which presents an extremely practical problem: staying awake. The earliest substantial history of coffee we have was compiled in 1587 by a scholar named Abd al-Qadir al-Jaziri, and he records that a Sufi sheikh named Jamal al-Din al-Dabani, the Mufti of Aden, adopted the use of coffee around 1454. What he found was that it drove away fatigue and lethargy and brought to the body a certain sprightliness and vigor. That is the beginning, not a goatherd. A group of mystics who needed to pray all night and found something that let them. And notice what coffee was at that moment. It wasn't a luxury or a pleasure. It was a spiritual technology, a tool for staying present with God. That is why it spread through the Islamic world, rather than being rejected by it. Wine was forbidden. Coffee appears nowhere in the Quran. It offered alertness rather than intoxication, and it arrived attached to devotion. From the Sufi monasteries, it moved outward, fast. By 1414, it was known in Mecca. Within a century, it had reached Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, Persia, Turkey, and North Africa. And it moved through one port, a small city on the Red Sea coast of Yemen called Mocha. For roughly 200 years, essentially all the coffee in the world passed through Mocha. The name is still on your cafe menu 5 centuries later, and most people ordering a mocha have no idea they're naming a Yemeni harbor. Yemen understood exactly what it had, and it did what any power with a monopoly does. It defended it ruthlessly. The rule was simple and effective. Coffee could be exported. Living coffee could not. Every bean that left Mocha had to be boiled or roasted first, which killed the seed. You could buy all the coffee you wanted. You could not grow it. Taking a fertile bean or a seedling out of the country was punishable by death. That single policy held for around 2 centuries, and it made Yemen extraordinarily rich. But something else was happening, and it worried people far more than the trade did. Because coffee did not stay in the monasteries. It moved into the cities, and in the cities, it created something that had not existed before. The coffee house, the café cane. Understand what was new here.
It is said
Every society
that
has
this
places to drink.
softens the
What the
heart.
coffee house offered was different. A public room where you did not get drunk, where you stayed sharp, where you sat for hours, and where, crucially, the man beside you might be anybody. A merchant next to a scholar, next to a soldier, next to a poet. Rank mattered less inside those rooms than outside them. People played chess. They listened to music and storytellers. They read. And overwhelmingly, they talked. About business, about religion, and about the government. That last one is what caused all the trouble. In 1511, in Mecca, a market inspector named Khair Beg moved against coffee. The stated objections were religious, that coffee was intoxicating like wine and therefore forbidden. Scholars were assembled. The properties of the drink were debated seriously and at length. But look at what actually seems to have provoked him. By the accounts that survive, satirical verses mocking Khair Beg had been circulating out of the coffee houses. The authorities were also openly worried that these rooms were becoming places where people gathered to talk freely about politics and that they could become centers of disorder. Khair Beg banned it, and here is the pattern that is going to repeat for the next 200 years, in city after city, empire after empire. The ban failed. The Sultan in Cairo, who liked coffee, overruled him. Within a few years, coffee was legal again in Mecca, and Khair Beg was gone. Coffee would be banned at least 5 separate times in different places over the following centuries. Every single ban failed. Next came the Ottomans. The first coffee house opened in Istanbul in 1554, and the city took to it completely. Grand establishments with cushions and carpets, music, chess, poetry, and constant conversation. Within decades, there were hundreds, and Ottoman authorities came to precisely the same conclusion the Meccan authorities had. In the 17th century, Sultan Murad IV moved hard against the coffee houses of the empire, closing them, tearing them down, imposing severe penalties on those who kept drinking. Some accounts claim the penalty was death, and it may well have been in some cases, though the detail has grown in the retelling. It didn't work either. It never worked. Ask yourself why a sultan cares what people drink. He didn't. What he cared about was a room full of literate, alert, unsupervised men, talking about him. Then coffee reached Europe. It came through Venice, the great trading bridge between the Ottoman world and Christendom, in the early 1600s. And it arrived under suspicion. A Muslim drink. Dark, bitter, foreign. There's a story that Pope Clement VIII was urged to condemn it, tasted it, enjoyed it too much to ban it, and blessed it instead. It's a lovely anecdote, and it's poorly documented, so treat it as a story people like to tell. The first European coffee houses opened in Venice around the middle of the century, and then coffee reached England, and something genuinely remarkable happened. The first English coffeehouse opened in Oxford around 1650, run by a merchant of Middle Eastern origin. London followed in 1652, and the institution exploded. By the 1670s, there were thousands of coffeehouses in England. In London, they were on every significant street. The English called them penny universities. The name is exact. For 1 penny, the price of a cup, you got the coffee, and you also got the newspapers, the pamphlets, the newsletters, and the conversation. There were no lectures and no fees and no entrance requirements. You simply sat down, and knowledge moved across the tables. And because a penny was affordable to a much wider slice of society than any university was, the room mixed people who would otherwise never have argued with each other. A merchant debating shipping with a sea captain, a lawyer arguing with a clergyman, a physician explaining anatomy to whoever was listening, a poet trying out lines. Each house developed a character, and this is where it stops being a social curiosity and starts building the modern world. At Edward Lloyd's coffeehouse on Lombard Street, shipowners, captains, and merchants gathered to trade maritime news and underwrite each other's voyages against loss. That room became Lloyd's of London, still one of the most important insurance markets on earth. At Jonathan's coffeehouse in Exchange Alley, stock traders, who had been thrown out of the Royal Exchange for being too rowdy, met to buy and sell. That room became the London Stock Exchange. At the Grecian, members of the Royal Society argued mathematics, optics, and natural philosophy. Isaac Newton was among them. At Will's, John Dryden held court with the poets of the Restoration. Modern insurance, the modern stock market, organized experimental science, English literary criticism. 4 of the load-bearing institutions of the modern world grew out of rooms where men sat, drinking a Yemeni beverage, and refused to stop talking. Which brings us to a king. Charles II did not like coffeehouses. In 1672, he issued a proclamation to restrain the spreading of false news and licentious talking of matters of state, and coffeehouses were named specifically. His Secretary of State, Sir Joseph Williamson, ran a network of informers who sat in London coffeehouses and reported on what was being said. Think about that for a moment. A 17th century surveillance program targeting cafes. And on the 29th of December, 1675, Charles II went all the way. He issued a proclamation for the suppression of coffeehouses, declaring that they had produced very evil and dangerous effects, that false, malicious, and scandalous reports were devised and spread in them to the defamation of his government, and that they were a disturbance of the peace and quiet of the realm. Every coffeehouse in England was to close. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The outcry was organized, in large part, through the very coffeehouses he was trying to shut. Merchants, traders, writers, and ordinary drinkers pushed back hard. The ban lasted 11 days. The King of England attempted to close the cafes and folded inside a fortnight. And he understood exactly what he was doing. That's the interesting part. Charles II was not being paranoid about a beverage. He had correctly identified that a public space where anyone could hear the news and argue about the government was a structural threat to a monarchy. He was right. He just couldn't stop it. The same thing happened in France, with larger consequences. Café Procope opened in Paris in 1686 and became the intellectual center of the city. Voltaire drank there. The stories about how many cups a day are exaggerated, but he was a fixture. Rousseau was there. Diderot worked on the Encyclopédie in that world of cafes. And a century later, in the summer of 1789, the cafes around the Palais Royal were where Parisians gathered to hear the news, read the pamphlets aloud, and work themselves toward the Bastille. Coffee did not cause the Enlightenment, and it did not cause the French Revolution. That claim gets made constantly, and it's too neat. What coffee did was provide the room, a sober, public, mixed, affordable space where ideas could be tested out loud at speed. That's not the same as causing a revolution. It's something more interesting. It's the infrastructure a revolution needs. But all of this, every coffeehouse in London and Paris and Vienna, depended on beans that still, overwhelmingly, came through one Yemeni port. That was about to end, and it ended through theft. Tradition tells of an Indian Sufi named Baba Budan, who passed through Mocha on pilgrimage, tasted coffee, and resolved to bring it home. Fertile beans could not leave. So, the story goes, he strapped 7 green beans to his body, walked them past the port inspectors, and planted them in the hills of Chandragiri in southern India. Those hills carry his name today. Sources place this anywhere from 1600 to 1670, and the documentation is thin, but coffee did take root in India in roughly this period. Then the Dutch, who were far more systematic about it. In 1616, a Dutch merchant named Peter van den Broeke obtained live coffee plants from Mocha and got them back to Amsterdam. The Dutch established cultivation in Ceylon by 1658 and in Java by the 1690s, which is why, 400 years later, people still call a cup of coffee a cup of Java. In 1706, the Dutch shipped coffee plants from Java back to the Botanical Garden in Amsterdam. That handful of plants became one of the most consequential genetic bottlenecks in agricultural history. Most of the Arabica later grown across Latin America descends from them. In 1714, the mayor of Amsterdam presented one of those plants to King Louis XIV of France. It was installed in the Royal Botanical Garden in Paris and guarded closely. And in 1723, a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu decided he wanted it. De Clieu was stationed in Martinique and was convinced the climate would suit coffee. He asked for a cutting from the king's tree. He was refused, so he obtained one anyway. The voyage across the Atlantic became one of the great stories in the history of agriculture, and it's worth saying that most of it comes from de Clieu's own later account, and it has certainly grown in the retelling. As he told it, a fellow passenger tried to destroy the seedling. Pirates attacked. A storm nearly sank the ship. Then the vessel was becalmed, drinking water was rationed, and de Clieu shared his own ration with the plant, day after day, until land appeared. One seedling survived. He planted it in Martinique. Within 50 years, there were around 18 million coffee trees on that island. And that single plant is regarded as the ancestor of most of the coffee grown across the Caribbean, Central and South America. 4 years later, in 1727, Portugal wanted in. Brazil sent a lieutenant colonel named Francisco de Melo Paleta to French Guiana, officially to mediate a border dispute, unofficially to come back with coffee. The French refused to sell. Paleta, according to the story that everyone tells and nobody can prove, charmed the French governor's wife. And, at his farewell, she presented him with a bouquet of flowers with coffee seeds hidden inside it, in front of her husband. That bouquet founded the Brazilian coffee industry, which is today the largest on earth. And now, we have to talk about the part of this story that usually gets left out. Because the moment coffee left Yemen and became a plantation crop in the Americas, it stopped being a story about monks and philosophers and became something else entirely. Coffee is enormously labor-intensive. The cherries ripen unevenly, so they have to be picked by hand, repeatedly, over a long season. Growing it at the scale Europe now demanded required an immense amount of human labor, and the European colonial powers had a system for that. By 1788, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the western third of the island of Hispaniola, today Haiti, was producing roughly half of all the coffee in the world. It was produced by enslaved Africans on plantations widely recorded as among the most brutal in the Caribbean. In 1791, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue rose against that system in the revolution that would create Haiti. The coffee plantations were destroyed. Half the world's coffee supply went with them. The industry moved on, and it moved to Brazil, where it was built, for decades, on the same foundation. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888, and its rise to coffee dominance in the 19th century ran directly on enslaved labor. So the penny universities of London, the cafes of the Enlightenment, the rooms where modern insurance and the stock exchange and experimental science were argued into existence, all of that was supplied, for a long and specific period, by people who had been carried across an ocean in chains to pick the cherries. Both halves of that are true at once. That's the honest version. Today, coffee is grown across a belt around the equator: Brazil, Vietnam, Colombia, Indonesia, Ethiopia. Around 2 billion cups a day. Some 60% of the wild coffee species on Earth are now considered at risk of extinction, largely from climate change and habitat loss, and much of the genetic diversity we may need to save the crop still sits in the forests of Ethiopia, where it started, which is the strangest turn in the whole story. After 6 centuries of being smuggled, monopolized, banned, industrialized, and spread to every continent that will grow it, the future of coffee may depend on going back to the highlands it came from. The story of coffee reminds us that the most ordinary things in our lives are never actually ordinary. Every one of them arrived by a route someone fought over, and the cost of getting it to us is usually written in a history we've stopped reading.